USDA rural affordable housing programs and started using low-income tax credits for one reason and one reason only. Because low-income tax credits generate profits for the investors that are buying those tax credits. And so therefore, that became a good funding stream for building affordable housing. The problem with it is, in order for those investors to get the profit on their investment, the housing couldn't be affordable to the poorest of the poor. And so now we have our largest affordable housing program in the United States is no longer affordable to the poorest people who live in the United States. And it's why you hear so much about our housing being developed these days that is 60% of median income, 80% of median income. Most people have no idea what the hell median income is, but that's the language that you'll hear when you hear them talking about it, even talking about 120% of median income. Median income is that the baseline, there's this many people above that income level, there's this many people below that income level. So that becomes the median income. The wealthier your community, the higher that median income is set at. And so when you're talking 60 to 80% of that median income, the people that are poor, the people that are homeless and poor, the people in public housing are generally at 12 to 17% of median income in any given community. So you have this whole population of people that are no longer receiving housing assistance, whose housing has been torn down through Hope 6 or torn down through the selling off of public housing buildings, taken off the market because Section 8, which is mainly run by private investors, it's an old funding program for affordable housing, but even that was based at a third of your income. Regardless of what your income was, a third of it would go to your housing and the rest of the subsidy, the housing subsidy from the feds, would make up so that the owner of the property was getting fair market rate for those units. It actually was a really good way to do development, because if you could go to a bank and say, I've got Section 8 certificates on a third of my units, you could pretty much guarantee that you'd get a loan to do the rest of it. So it wasn't that the program itself was a failure. It was that it wasn't seen as generating enough of an investment, of a profit. And Reagan's mantra, the Reagan Revolution, really was about bringing neoliberal economics to the United States. And the Reagan mantra of government is bad, business is good, government should get out of the way. Business doesn't run on a loss. Business doesn't if you're running a private business, I don't care whether it's a giant one or a little one, and you consistently run at a pace where you're spending more than you're generating in income, you're going to get fired. Government isn't supposed to run that way. Government collects taxes and is supposed to put that money out for the benefit of all people. But now government, we're privatizing the state of Michigan is now privatizing the whole freeway repair system. You know, we've privatized our public parks. We're privatizing our schools. We're privatizing our jails. We long ago privatized our military. Well, we're also privatizing housing. And it's created a situation where if your income level is such that I'm not able to generate a profit, and I, being the government, am not able to show that providing you with health care or providing you with housing or providing you with an education isn't generating a profit for anybody, then it's no longer a worthwhile endeavor. And it's not something that government's going to invest in. Public parks should be public-private partnerships, and then we put McDonald's in Yosemite or whatever. You know, so that we can generate revenue, not we as a community, so that somebody can generate some revenue off of the fact that our public parks exist. That wasn't the intent of public parks. You started to raise your hand?
Well, there's a point at which assuming profit is the motivating factor distorts what's really happening. If you can house somebody for $7,000 and it costs you $100,000 to give them services, then you want to house them before you give them services and save $93,000.
Is it you're thinking it's an either or?
No, it's a case of labeling. If you're calling something absent profit, when in fact you could be saving money, saving tax money or any other kind of money by affording someone a house directly, because
Yeah.
housing is the first step. If you do that, then you have saved $93,000
Oh
in
yeah.
taxes.
Oh no. I mean, the whole existence of the multi-billion-dollar a year homeless stuff right now. I think it's $4 billion in federal funding alone. Is a total waste of money and was completely unnecessary. Because when we still had this funding stream for affordable housing, we didn't have all these homeless programs. We had people living on Skid Row that were hardcore alkies or whatever. We had domestic violence centers, which unfortunately hardly freaking exist anymore. And we had emergency shelters when there was a crisis. In fact, in '83, when we started opening our shelters across the country, the original funding source from the federal government for emergency shelters in the United States was FEMA. It was considered a crisis. Everything was funded as a temporary program. And all of the expenditures from '83 to today that have gone out at the local, state, and federal level, had we just kept the funding stream that existed, rural housing was building 32,000 units a year of affordable housing in rural communities. The last 5 years, it's been 0. So obviously, the answer to homelessness is housing. Obviously. And it shouldn't require, I heard you guys are spending $69,000 this year in homeless management information system. Like, my God. I mean, they could read without housing and they would get the idea that, you know, before the HUD cuts and the USDA cuts, we didn't have the emergency shelter system. After it, immediately after it, we did. I mean, everything beyond that is a total waste of money. But as with HMIS, as with Danco, people are making money implementing these systems. And that money is considered good money because that money is going to enterprise. Money for individuals, as you see with welfare reform, you know, isn't it ironic, like when the banks screwed up, they got cash, billions of dollars in cash. Because cash is what saves corporate America. Poor people don't need cash. Cash isn't what they need. They need life skills training. They need case management. They need to be drug tested. They need, in San Francisco and a couple other communities now, they call it care, not cash. So if you're poor and you're homeless and you apply for welfare assistance, in the old days, they would have you sweep the streets. They would have you work for whatever it was you were getting if you were able to work. Now you get a shelter bill because cash is not what's going to help poor people when they're in poverty. What helps poor people when they're in poverty is care. And the amazing thing is the ones that teach the life skills training classes for poor people, 99% have never been poor. So apparently, even in that realm, you don't have to experience poverty to train poor people about how to deal with poverty. You have to train poor people how to fit into a system that, frankly, more and more of us feel like doesn't want you in the system. And clearly, if you're a family, as of 5 years ago, you know, 5 years ago when like your program here was shut down that serves families and now it's serving chronic homeless single adults. The MAC Center, is that what it's called? It wasn't because family and homelessness ended, by the way, folks. That's not why that program did that. The reason that program did that is because the funding stream was changed, and the way that the funding stream was changed was the federal government redefined, in writing a 101-page memo, as only HUD could write. It took 101 pages to redefine when a family counts as being homeless. And so a family that's doubled up or tripled up or living in an SRO hotel room, single room occupancy hotel room, in order to keep their kids out of the elements, no longer qualifies for homeless services. That family literally has to be in the street in order to be eligible to receive emergency services. Think of how ironic that is. And the same with youth. And the reason why is because they wanted to do this single adult chronic homeless initiative, so Utah could say they ended homelessness or whatever we're talking about. They wanted to do it, but they knew that they didn't have the money to do it. So by redefining the eligibility status for this pool of money, emergency shelter money, you could cut out a whole bunch of people that are using those services. And the most expensive people to serve are families. And so by cutting out the families, you could do 12 single adult living in a space for the cost of one family living in a space. And so it became a simple matter of math and public relations. And the fact that newspaper reporters and TV reporters and not the local radio reporters, because so many of these other reporters, they know point in time head counts. They all know it. And they know that families were cut out of access to emergency services because they were deemed as too expensive to serve. And so the whole chronic homeless initiative is being done on the backs of homeless children and of youth, because that's where the money came from in order to implement those initiatives. Now, I remember from coming up off the streets as a 23-year-old, 22-year-old, in this shelter, and if an old person showed up or a family showed up, you would go to somebody like my age and say, hey, dude, I need that space for this other person or for this kid. And they would get, if you asked homeless people, should we redefine families' access to homeless services so that you can get an SRO unit, 9 out of 10 of them will tell you, oh, hell no. So this didn't come from the homeless community. This didn't come from any sense of humanity. No, this came strictly from, this is an issue to manage, and it's an issue about money. And it's an issue about how do we give the pretense. I wish every service provider would say, I'm not going to your continuum of care meetings. They won't, because that's where their money comes from, and they will be shut down, trust me. Unless enough of us do it, all at the same time, they will get shut down. I'm not saying I don't understand perfectly well why they don't do it. I'm just saying I really wish they would do it, because when we give these presentations, and I have a whole thing that I'll save for tonight, just about the vicious cycle of community planning process in addressing homelessness. It's freaking amazing. And when you've been around as long as I have, I've been through all of it, from FEMA to Gingrich's Contract on America, or they called it Contract with America. But the whole welfare reform system, and that's when continuum of care was a 5-year plan. And then under Bush, it became a 10-year plan. And now we only care about vets. It's like, you know what? VA used to build housing. VA, Veterans Administration, used to build housing. There's a whole town on Long Island that Levittown, Long Island. So long as they weren't black vets, they could live there. It's true. It's absolutely true. A lot of the original public housing agencies were the same way. So it wasn't like some of the stuff we deal with today didn't still exist. It was a little bit more out front about it, but it's still, and it definitely still existed. But the VA did medical care, the college loans, actually it wasn't even a loan. It was they would pay for you to go to college. And they would give you really low interest loans to buy a home. And they would finance the development of those homes. That's all gone. And maybe to some extent the medical care is all they focus on, but the college loans, that's all gone. And now we're supposed to take McKinney homeless money that was created to do emergency services in response to the fact that HUD and USDA stopped funding housing. And really, when you look at in 87, when the McKinney-Vento Act is what it's called, because they named these programs after dead politicians. And so the guy that wrote the thing was Stuart McKinney. He was out of Minnesota. He was the first one, and it was very decent. He was like, we need to create a federal funding stream to address homelessness in America, because it's gotten, from 83 to 87, it had gotten so. And then this other guy, Vento, added his name to it. And so it's called the McKinney-Vento Act. But the speeches that were given at the time, including one pretty eloquent one by Al Gore, was this isn't about housing. This is about emergency services for homeless people. What we need to do to address this issue is we need to restore the cuts to housing that are happening in HUD. And this was like right on this chart, this was like right around that time. And as you can see, it just didn't happen. And the homeless situation continued to grow. And these are older posters that you'll see updated versions in our report and on our website. All this stuff is on our website. We did a whole report in 2010 updating this data. Sorry to say, it just has gotten worse. And now on our website, we have this updated to 2014. We didn't want to write a report to write a report, to write an update, to write a report. You know, they're actually good for getting funding because foundations freaking love reports. But it also felt redundant. You know, when you're doing a historical analysis, like in the main premise of this report is, how did we get here? Like, really just trying to lock into, if we look at what happened right before we started opening our shelters, maybe we would get a sense of what we need to do to address it. Because frankly, mental illness predates 1983. I'm pretty sure substance abuse predates 1983.
Oh, I know that.
For me and you too, bro. Lord knows racism and classism predates 1983. So all of those other human factors that go into our community all pre-existed. What significantly changed for all of us was this stuff. And so that's why we tried to reframe the debate into one that looks at, this isn't homelessness, this is houselessness. You know, and if you build housing, homeless people will come. You know, and it's really amazing. They've spent $3 million recently doing a 4-year study that found that families that get a decent place to live that are coming out of homeless programs, 98% of them are still in those housing units 4 years later. You could have just sort of asked them, do you plan on being here 4 years from now? Oh, hell yeah, okay. You know? And I always found it ironic because, you know, having been homeless, and now I'm a freaking homeowner. And being a homeowner beats out of being homeless. Like, you would not believe it. You know, and if you all want to give me $4 million, I can put it in a report for you. I do write reports, so I can even make a poster out of it if you want. But like, so we felt that it was important, since we are in a bunch of different cities and we are in several different states. Like, we felt that it was important that we have something to say if we were going to bring these groups together, and that we find the common links, whether you're in Sacramento, whether you're in LA, whether you're in Denver, whether you're in Portland, the common links. And the common links that we found in our communities was the criminalization of poor people, not just homeless people, the criminalization of poverty, and the lack of access to affordable housing in community after community. And so those became the two target areas. And so we did this report. Another irony out of this report was looking at what a housing subsidy is. Whether if you owe me $50 and I tell you to keep it, I just gave you $50. If you ask me for $50 and I give you a $50 bill, I just gave you $50. In either way, I just subsidized whatever it was you were using that $50 for. So clearly, a housing subsidy in the form of a tax break and a tax credit is absolutely the same thing as a housing subsidy in the form of a direct payment for your housing. So the housing subsidies for poor people equal $34 billion roughly a year. The housing subsidies for homeownership equal about, and the Joint Committee of Taxation couldn't give us anything in writing except to say the number you seek does not exist when we ask for a hard number, but it's estimated at $144 billion a year. And it was when this was up around the, $2,004, so it was up around $80 billion a year in affordable housing funding. The homeowner housing subsidy programs were about 50-something billion dollars a year. So they used to be around the same level, a little higher, a little back and forth. But it used to be housing subsidy was a housing subsidy was a housing subsidy was a housing subsidy. And as we wiped this out, the homeowner housing subsidies quadrupled. So you see that it was never an issue, even though you hear all the time that we're not doing the affordable housing because we can't afford it. It was never, ever, ever an issue of we can't afford it. It was an issue of who was receiving the subsidies and where was that subsidy money going. And the homeowner housing subsidy program is what I call it. Other people call it the mortgage interest tax deduction and property tax and interest deduction and blah, blah, blah. But the homeowner housing subsidy program is run by the IRS. So it never gets debated as to whether or not it's a housing program that we can afford in the United States. Because if the homeowner writes in and deducts that money from their taxes, that subsidy is paid out to that homeowner. The interest goes to mortgage companies, it goes to banks, and our interest rates would be a hell of a lot lower if that interest wasn't deductible. Anybody who's dealt with a mortgage broker has heard that, oh, it's okay, don't worry, it's deductible. So when we started looking at our issue, we focused it on what is equity and what is fair and how do we want to frame it. And we would rather frame the debate around the housing stuff in this context. That if it's good enough for one class of people, then it's probably something that's good for everybody else too. And if you're not going to be able to afford to subsidize housing, then you shouldn't be able to afford to subsidize housing for one economic class of people and not able to subsidize the housing for the other people. And if you really got no money for housing, do this to everybody and do it equally, or don't do it to anybody, and make sure that everybody has access to it. Because quite frankly, if you're going to have a government, what's wrong with prioritizing education, healthcare, housing, and if you're going to be in a capitalist system, then probably you want to make sure, if we were doing barters and using rocks, we would probably want to make sure everybody's got a couple of rocks. If we're going to do capitalism, then we might want to make sure everybody's got a couple of dollars. If that's how the system is going to work, make sure it works for everybody. And that was the goal of Social Security, is you shouldn't work your whole life, or you shouldn't be in a position where you're disabled and you're just not going to be able to afford to live in this country anymore. And now we see that even that's under attack.